Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today we're going back to 1849 in Georgia, to the incredible story of a giant enslaved man who fought a titanoboa to save a young girl, an encounter so brutal and unbelievable that people on the plantation whispered about it for years. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. In the summer of 1849, in the cotton fields of Burke County, Georgia, something happened that no one could explain. A 7-year-old girl walked out of a swamp that had swallowed grown men whole. She was carried in the arms of a giant, and behind them, dragged through the mud, lay the body of a creature that should not exist. This is that story. But to understand what happened in those dark waters, we need to go back. We need to understand the land, the people, and the man they called Goliath. Georgia in 1849 was a state built on cotton and blood. The invention of the cotton gin 56 years earlier had transformed the South into an agricultural empire, and Georgia sat at its heart. Burke County alone produced over 40,000 bales of cotton that year. Each bale weighed approximately 400 lb. Each pound was picked by hand. Each hand belonged to someone who had no choice. The Whitmore plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of fertile land along the Ogeee River. It was not the largest plantation in the county, but it was among the most profitable. Colonel Marcus Whitmore, a veteran of the Creek War of 1836, ran his operation with military precision. He owned 112 enslaved people. To him, they were not people at all. They were inventory, numbers in a ledger, tools that happened to breathe. The plantation house stood on a small hill overlooking the fields. It was a white column structure in the Greek Revival style, popular among wealthy Southern planters who saw themselves as heirs to ancient democratic traditions. The irony of slaveholders celebrating democracy was lost on no one except the Whitmores themselves. Beyond the fields, past the slave quarters, past the smokehouse and the blacksmith shop, the land changed. The soil grew wet, the trees grew thick, Spanish moss hung from branches like the beards of dead men, and then came the swamp. The Ogeechee Swamp was not large by Georgia standards. It covered perhaps 3,000 acres of cypress trees, black water, and secrets. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in reputation. The enslaved people of Burke County had a name for it. They called it the mouth because things went in. They did not come out. Overseers used the swamp as a threat. Runaways were told that the mouth would swallow them whole. Children were warned that monsters lived in the black water, waiting for disobedient souls. And in the firelit darkness of the slave quarters, when the white folks were asleep and the night belonged to whispered truths, the old ones spoke of something else, something ancient. Something that had lived in those waters since before the Cherokee walked this land, since before memory itself. They called it the Devil's Rope. Most enslaved people believed it was just a story, a tale passed down through generations to frighten children into obedience. But some of them had seen things, ripples in water that should have been still trees that shook when there was no wind, sounds in the night that belonged to no animal anyone could name. And once, many years ago, a fielder named Solomon had run into the swamp to escape a beating. They found his leg 3 days later washed up on the bank. Just the leg. The rest of him was never seen again. The swamp was not a place for the living. The man arrived at Whitmore Plantation in the spring of 1847, 2 years before our story truly begins. He came in a cage on the back of a wagon, transported like a circus animal through the red dirt roads of rural Georgia. The cage was necessary, the slave trader explained, because of what had happened at his previous plantation. He had killed an overseer with his bare hands. Colonel Whitmore examined the merchandise with the cold eye of a man who had spent 30 years buying and selling human beings. The enslaved man was enormous. He stood 6'7" tall, which was nearly unheard of in that era when the average man barely reached 5'7". His shoulders were as wide as a doorframe. His arms were thick as young oak branches. His hands could wrap around a man's skull the way a normal hand might grip a ripe apple. The trader had been calling him Samson, a common name for large enslaved men. It was a biblical joke that plantation owners found amusing. But Colonel Whitmore saw something in this one that was not amusing at all. He looked into the giant's eyes and saw emptiness. Complete and total emptiness. Like looking into a dried-up well. Like staring at a man who had already died, but whose body had not yet received the news. The price was suspiciously low, dangerously low, for a man of such obvious physical value. Single word in over a year. Some believed he was mute. Others believed he was simple-minded, damaged in some way that reduced his usefulness. The trader believed something else entirely. He believed that whatever had once lived inside this man was gone, and what remained was just a shell. A very large, very dangerous shell that no longer cared whether it lived or died. Colonel Whitmore bought him anyway. He saw potential where others saw problems. A man who did not speak would not spread discontent among the other slaves. A man who did not care about dying would not fear punishment. And a man of such remarkable size can do the work of 3 ordinary field hands, maybe 4. He renamed him Goliath because Whitmore fancied himself a man of biblical learning, and he believed that even giants could be brought low by the right master. Goliath's first months at Whitmore Plantation established his reputation quickly. He could lift a 400-rel cotton bale that normally required 2 strong men working together. He could pull a plow through rocky Georgia clay without the help of a mule. He could break a wild horse simply by gripping its head and holding it still until the animal exhausted itself from struggling. The other enslaved people watched him work with a mixture of awe and unease. The overseers watched him with hands always near their weapons, waiting for any excuse to assert their dominance over this unsettling giant. That excuse never came. Goliath did not resist. He did not complain. He did not even seem to register the world around him as anything more than a series of tasks to be completed. He woke when the horn sounded at 4:30 in the morning. He worked in the fields until the horn sounded again at 8,000 in the evening. He ate whatever food was placed in front of him, never asking for more, never leaving anything behind. He slept in the corner of the cabin he shared with 5 other men, always positioning himself with his back against the wall, always keeping his eyes open until sheer exhaustion finally pulled him under. The other enslaved people tried to reach him. At first, they were a community bound together by shared suffering, and a new arrival was always given the chance to become part of that community. An old woman named Mama Ruth, who had lived on the plantation for 40 years and served as a healer and spiritual guide for everyone in the quarters, made several attempts to draw him out. She sat with him in the evenings. She brought him extra food when she could manage it without being caught. She asked him gentle questions about where he came from, whether he had family somewhere, what his real name was, before the white folks gave him their biblical joke. He never answered. He never even acknowledged that she had spoken. But once when she asked if he understood her words, he turned and looked at her just for a moment, and in that look she saw something that made her old heart ache with recognition. She saw grief. Grief so deep and so vast that it had become an ocean, and this man was drowning in it far below the surface in waters so dark that no light could reach him. Mama Ruth stopped asking questions after that, but she continued to watch over him in her quiet way, making sure he received his share of whatever small comforts the enslaved community could provide for its members. And every night she added his name to her prayers, asking the Lord to find some way to reach a man who seemed determined to be unreachable. The overseers had a different relationship with Goliath. Thomas Callahan, a head overseer, was an Irish immigrant who had clawed his way up from the poverty of the New York docks by proving he could be more brutal than any Southern-born white man. He had learned early that poor whites in the South were only respected when they demonstrated absolute dominance over the enslaved population. Cruelty was his currency, and he spent it freely. Callahan saw Goliath as a challenge, a test of his authority. For the first 6 months, he actively looked for reasons to discipline the giant. He watched for any sign of laziness, any hint of defiance, any excuse to use his whip and prove that no slave was too large or too strong to be broken. But Goliath never gave him that excuse. He worked harder than anyone else on the plantation. He followed every order without hesitation. He never raised his eyes to meet a white man's gaze. He was by every measure the perfect slave, and somehow that made Callahan hate him even more. Eventually, the overseer settled into an uneasy acceptance of the situation. He used Goliath for the hardest and most dangerous tasks on the plantation. He loaned him out to neighboring properties when they needed extra muscle for difficult work. He even began to brag about the giant to other overseers, as if Goliath's extraordinary strength was somehow a reflection of Callahan's own skill at managing slaves. But Callahan never turned his back on him, not once, because he remembered what the slave trader had mentioned during the sale. This one had killed an overseer at his previous plantation, killed him with his bare hands. And he had done it, the trader whispered, because the overseer had whipped a child, not his child, just a child, a little girl who had committed the unforgivable sin of dropping a water bucket. After learning that story, Callahan looked at Goliath differently. He looked at him the way a man might look at a loaded pistol left carelessly on a table. Useful, valuable, but capable of destruction beyond imagination if handled the wrong way. 2 years passed on Whitmore Plantation. The seasons turned in their eternal cycle. 1847 became 1848, and 1848 became 1849. Cotton was planted in the spring and harvested in the fall. Enslaved people were born in the cramped cabins of the quarters, and others died from disease or exhaustion or the simple accumulation of too much suffering. Some were sold away to settle debts or punish disobedience, disappearing down the road in the back of a wagon, never to be seen again. Through it all, Goliath remained exactly the same, silent, obedient, empty. The other enslaved people had stopped trying to reach him. They simply accepted him as part of the landscape, like the ancient oak tree in the center of the quarters, or the distant line of cypress trees that marked the edge of the swamp. He was there. He worked. He existed. That was all. Then, in May of 1849, a wagon arrived at the plantation carrying new inventory. Colonel Whitmore had purchased 5 enslaved people from an estate sale in Savannah. 3 adults and 2 children bought us a lot at a price that suggested the previous owner had died in debt, and his creditors were eager to liquidate his assets quickly. Among them was a girl. Her name was Hope. She was 7 years old. Her skin was the color of dark honey, and her eyes were too large for her face, giving her an appearance of perpetual wonder at the world around her. Unlike most children who arrived at plantations after being torn from their families, she was not crying when the wagon pulled into the yard. She sat upright on the wooden bench, with her back straight and her chin held high, studying her new prison with an intensity that seemed far beyond her years. The other enslaved people noticed her immediately. Children were common on plantations, born into bondage and put to work as soon as they were old enough to carry a bucket or pick worms off tobacco leaves. But there was something different about this one, a spark behind her eyes that had not yet been extinguished, a spirit that the world had not yet managed to crush. The adults in the quarters whispered among themselves that she would learn soon enough. The world would teach her to lower her eyes and bend her back and accept that she was property to be used and discarded at the whim of white folks. It always did. No one escaped that lesson. Hope was assigned to the children's work crew as was standard for her age. She spent her days carrying water to the field hands, collecting eggs from the hen house, and pulling weeds from the vegetable garden. The work was exhausting for a child her size, but she did it without complaint. Complaining, she had learned through bitter experience, accomplished nothing except to draw unwanted attention. But while she worked, she watched. She watched everything and everyone around her with those 2 large eyes, absorbing information, cataloging faces and behaviors and routines. She listened to the conversations of the adults when they thought no child was paying attention. She studied the overseers and learned which ones were merely cruel and which ones were genuinely dangerous. And she noticed the giant. It was impossible not to notice him. He towered over everyone else in the fields, a mountain of muscle moving through the cotton rows. But what caught Hope's attention was not his size. It was the way the other enslaved people moved around him. They gave him space. They avoided looking at him directly. They treated him like something to be feared or pied. She could not tell which. Hope watched him from a distance for 3 days during every spare moment she could find. She watched how he worked, how he moved, how he sat alone under a massive oak tree during the brief Sunday rest period, while everyone else gathered in small groups to share what little comfort they could find in each other's company. She saw that he never spoke to anyone. She saw the emptiness in his eyes that Mama Ruth had recognized 2 years earlier, and on the 4th day, she made her decision. Sunday afternoon on a plantation was precious time. It was the only period during the week when enslaved people were not required to work, and they guarded those few hours jealously. Most used the time to tend their small garden plots where they grew vegetables to supplement the meager rations provided by the plantation. Others washed their clothing in the creek or simply sat in exhausted silence, trying to gather enough strength to survive another week. Goliath sat alone under the oak tree, as he did every Sunday. His massive hands rested on his knees like tools that had been temporarily set aside. His eyes were fixed on some distant point that only he could see. The other enslaved people had long since stopped wondering what he was looking at. They assumed it was nothing, just the blank stare of a mind that had stopped working. Hope walked directly up to him and planted herself in front of his face, forcing herself into his line of sight. The other children had warned her to stay away from the giant. They said he was dangerous. They said he had killed a white man and would surely kill again if provoked. But Hope had spent her short life learning to read people, and she did not see danger in this man. She saw something else entirely. She saw loneliness so profound that it had become a physical presence, like a wall built around him to keep the world at bay. Hope sat down in the dirt across from him, crossed her legs, and began to talk. She talked about herself, about the plantation she had been sold from, about the work she had been assigned. She talked about her mother and father and baby brother, all of whom had been sold away from her at different times, scattered to the winds by a system that treated families as collections of individual assets to be divided for maximum profit. She talked about the things she remembered and the things she was trying not to forget. Goliath listened. At first his expression did not change. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point, and Hope might have thought he was not hearing her at all. But gradually, so slowly that it was almost imperceptible, his gaze shifted. He began to look at her, to see her. It was his first real acknowledgement of another human being in over 2 years. Hope returned every Sunday after that. She would find him under the oak tree and sit with him for as long as she could before the evening horn called everyone back to their duties. She did most of the talking, narrating her week, sharing observations about the people around them, describing the dreams she had at night. She asked him questions, not expecting answers, just wanting him to know that she was interested in who he was beneath that wall of silence. Week by week, something began to change. Goliath started responding, not with words, but with small movements. A nod when she asked if he was comfortable. A shake of his head when she asked if he wanted her to leave. A slight relaxation of his rigid posture that suggested he was becoming accustomed to her presence, maybe even welcoming it. The other enslaved people watched this strange friendship develop with growing unease. Most of them thought Hope was foolish to spend her precious rest time with a broken man who could offer her nothing. Some thought she was brave, and Mama Ruth, who had seen more of life than anyone else in the quarters, watched with something that felt dangerously like hope. She confided in one of the other elders that the child was accomplishing something miraculous. She was reaching a man who had retreated so far into himself that everyone else had given up on him. Somehow, this little girl had found a door that no one else even knew existed. By late August, 3 months after Hope's arrival, the impossible happened. Goliath spoke. It was a Sunday afternoon like any other. Hope had been telling him about a butterfly she had seen in the fields, a large one with wings the color of sunset. She was describing how it had landed on her hand and stayed there for a long moment before flying away, and she had felt like it was trying to tell her something, though she could not imagine what. Then she asked him, as she had asked many times before, what his real name was, not the name the white folks had given him, the name his mother had chosen for him when he came into this world. The silence stretched on so long that Hope thought he was not going to answer. She had grown used to his silence and no longer expected anything different. But then in a voice rough and cracked from 2 years of disuse, he spoke. Isaiah. Hope repeated the name, tasting it, learning its shape. She told him she liked it. She said it sounded like a name from the Bible. And Mama Ruth sometimes talked about Isaiah the prophet, who spoke truth, even when people did not want to hear it. The giant who had been called Goliath, but whose name was really Isaiah, looked at this child who had refused to give up on him, and something shifted in his eyes. The emptiness receded just slightly, just enough for Hope to see that there was still a person inside that fortress of silence, a person who was slowly, painfully learning how to be alive again. He told her that his mother had named him after the prophet. She had believed that her son would grow up to speak truth and stand for righteousness in an unrighteous world. He did not tell Hope what had happened to his mother or to his wife or to his daughter Grace, who had been 6 years old when they sold her away from him. Those stories were still too heavy to speak aloud, but he told her his name, and for now that was enough. The weeks that followed saw Isaiah emerge slowly from his self-imposed isolation. He began to interact with the other enslaved people, not with words, but with small acts of assistance and acknowledgement. He helped Mama Ruth carry heavy things without being asked. He made room for others in the food line. He nodded in greeting when people passed him on the way to the fields. The community noticed these changes and did not know what to make of them. Some believed the giant was finally accepting his place among them. Others worried that any change in his behavior could be dangerous, that a man who had been empty for so long might become unpredictable as he started to feel things again. Mama Ruth understood what was really happening. She recognized the signs of a person coming back to life after a long period of grief-induced numbness. she also recognized the danger. Caring about people on a plantation was a risk that everyone understood. The system was designed to break bonds between enslaved people, to remind them constantly that anyone they loved could be taken from them at any moment. Parents watched their children sold away. Husbands were separated from wives. Friends were scattered to different plantations in different states, never to see each other again. The only way to survive such a world was to hold everything loosely, to never let yourself love anything too much. Isaiah had learned that lesson in the worst possible way. He had loved his daughter with all his heart, and when they took her from him, the grief had nearly destroyed him. He had survived only by shutting down completely, by refusing to feel anything at all. Now hope had awakened those feelings again, and Mama Ruth could see that Isaiah was allowing himself to care about this child, to feel protective of her the way he had felt protective of Grace. It was beautiful, it was human, and it was dangerous beyond measure. She warned him one evening as gently as she could. She reminded him of the reality of their situation. She told him that caring about someone on a plantation was an invitation to heartbreak, that the white folks could take anyone from them at any time, that he of all people knew this truth better than most. Isaiah listened to her warning with patience. Then he told her something that Mama Ruth would remember for the rest of her life. He said that if he stopped being able to care about other people, then the slave owners had truly won. They would have turned him into the thing they claimed all black people were, an animal without human feelings, without the capacity for love and sacrifice. He would not give them that victory. He would rather suffer the pain of potential loss than surrender his humanity to their system. Mama Ruth had no response to that. She simply patted his arm and walked away into the gathering darkness, adding a new layer to her nightly prayers. October brought an incident that would set the final tragedy in motion. Thomas Callahan, the head overseer, had been drinking heavily for several weeks. His wife had left him, run off with a traveling merchant who had promised her a better life in Charleston. The abandonment had wounded Callahan's pride in ways that no amount of whiskey could heal. And wounded pride in a man with power over others is a dangerous thing. He came to the slave quarters one night, well after midnight, carrying a lantern in one hand and his whip in the other. His face was flushed with alcohol and rage. The enslaved people knew what this meant. When Callahan came at night in this condition, someone was going to be hurt. The only question was who. Most of the people in the quarters stayed hidden in their cabins, making themselves as small and invisible as possible, praying that the overseer's random cruelty would pass them by. But Hope was sleeping deeply after a long day of work, and she did not wake quickly enough when Callahan kicked open the door of the children's cabin. He grabbed her before she understood what was happening. He dragged her out into the yard, shouting that this particular slave had been looking at him wrong, that she needed to learn her place, that he was going to teach her a lesson she would never forget. The commotion woke the entire quarters. Enslaved people appeared in doorways, watching helplessly as Callahan dragged the struggling child toward the whipping post in the center of the yard. They knew the rules. They knew that interfering with an overseer's discipline meant death, or worse, being sold to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where enslaved people rarely survived more than a few years. Isaiah emerged from his cabin like a force of nature rising from the earth. He did not run. He walked with slow, deliberate steps, his massive form illuminated by the moonlight. His eyes were fixed on Callahan and the child in his grip. There was no fear in his expression, no hesitation, only a cold certainty that radiated from him like heat from a forge. Callahan saw him coming and stopped. The drunken bravado drained from his face as he remembered the stories about this slave, the dead overseer at his previous plantation, the hands that could crush a man's skull. He pulled a pistol from his belt and aimed it at Isaiah's chest, ordering him to stop to get back to his cabin to mind his own business. Isaiah kept walking. The moments stretched like a rope pulled taut between two horses. Every enslaved person watching understood what was about to happen. Isaiah was going to die. He was going to force Callahan to shoot him, and then Callahan would beat Hope anyway, and nothing would have been accomplished except the death of one more black man in a state that had seen millions of such deaths. But then, Mama Ruth stepped forward. She placed herself between the two men and began speaking to Callahan in the subservient tone that enslaved people had learned to use when handling dangerous white folks. She apologized for the disturbance. She explained that the girl was new and did not yet understand plantation rules. She swore to personally teach the child proper behavior. She begged for mercy, performing the role of harmless old slave woman with practiced skill. It was a calculated gamble, and it worked. Callahan was drunk enough to accept an exit that preserved his authority without requiring him to actually shoot the giant, who was still staring at him with those empty, terrifying eyes. He announced that Isaiah would receive 20 lashes for threatening an overseer. He announced that if the girl caused any more trouble, he would personally feed her to the swamp. Then he shoved Hope toward Mama Ruth and ordered Isaiah to the whipping post. Isaiah went without resistance. He received 20 lashes while the entire quarters watched, and he did not make a single sound. His back was laid open to the bone in places, blood running down his dark skin in streams, and still he did not cry out. He simply kept his eyes fixed on Hope's face, holding her gaze throughout the ordeal, silently telling her that she was worth this pain, that he would endure anything to keep her safe. When it was over, the women rushed to tend his wounds while Callahan staggered away to his cabin. Hope knelt beside Isaiah as they laid him face down on a blanket, and she made him a promise. She told him that she would remember what he had done for her. She would remember it forever. Isaiah, weakened by blood loss and agony, told her that was not why he had done it. He had not done it to be remembered. He had done it because she reminded him of someone he had lost, someone he had failed to protect. He was not going to fail again. They lay together in Mama Ruth's cabin while she worked through the night cleaning and bandaging his wounds, and something crystallized between them, a bond forged in blood and sacrifice that went beyond the simple categories of family. They were not father and daughter. They both had real fathers somewhere in the world, lost to them forever, but they belonged to each other now in a way that no bill of sale could define or take away. 3 weeks later, Thomas Callahan made good on his threat. Isaiah's back had barely begun to heal. The wounds were still pink and tender, and Mama Ruth had warned him that any strenuous work could tear them open again. But cotton harvest waited for no one, and Isaiah had returned to the fields as soon as he could stand upright. It was a Thursday afternoon, the sky heavy with the promise of autumn rain, when Callahan rode his horse out to the fields where the enslaved people were picking cotton. He was sober this time, his eyes clear and cold, which somehow made what happened next even more horrifying. He pointed at Hope and ordered her to come to him. The child obeyed, walking toward the mounted overseer with a calm expression that masked the fear churning in her stomach. She had learned that showing fear only encouraged men like Callahan. Callahan announced to everyone within earshot that this particular slave had been a problem since her arrival. She asked too many questions. She had formed an inappropriate attachment to the simple-minded giant. She looked at white folks as if she considered herself their equal. He had decided it was time for her to learn what happened to uppity slaves. He reached down from his horse and grabbed her by the hair, lifting her small body off the ground like she weighed nothing at all. The field hands stopped working. 50 yards away, Isaiah began moving toward them, his massive hands already curling into fists. Callahan saw him coming and drew his pistol. He told Isaiah to stop where he was, or he would shoot him dead and feed the girl to the swamp anyway. It was his choice. Isaiah stopped. His entire body trembled with the effort of holding himself back, every muscle straining against the command of his conscious mind. But he stopped. Callahan smiled, the smile of a man who had just proven his power over those he considered less than human. He threw Hope across his saddle, kicked his horse into a gallop, and rode toward the swamp at the edge of the plantation. Isaiah watched them disappear into the tree. He watched until the sound of hoof beats faded into silence, and then, without a word to anyone, he began to walk in the same direction. One of the field hands grabbed his arm and tried to stop him. He warned Isaiah that following the overseer would mean his death. He said there was nothing anyone could do for the girl now. He begged Isaiah to be reasonable to accept this loss as enslaved people had learned to accept so many losses before. Isaiah looked at the man who was trying to save his life. His expression held no anger, no desperation, no fear, only a calm certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the reach of mortal concerns. He shook off the restraining hand and continued walking toward the swamp. The enslaved people watched him go. Some of them prayed, some of them wept, and Mama Ruth, standing at the edge of the cotton field with tears streaming down her weathered face, whispered a blessing for the giant who was walking to his death to save a child who was not his own. The edge of the Ogeechee swamp was marked by a transformation of the world itself. The firm red Georgia clay became soft black mud that sucked at Isaiah's feet with every step. The open air of the cotton fields became thick and heavy, saturated with moisture and the smell of vegetable decay. The sounds of the plantation, the distant shouts and songs that were the soundtrack of enslaved life faded away and were replaced by the alien symphony of the swamp. Insects buzzed in clouds. Birds called out in voices that sounded almost human. And beneath it all, beneath the surface of the black water that now rose to Isaiah's knees, there was something else, a feeling of being watched by something ancient and patient and hungry. Isaiah did not hesitate. He waded into the swamp like a man walking into his own grave, because that is exactly what he believed he was doing. He had no illusions about survival. He knew that he was going to die in this swamp, but he was going to find hope first. He was going to save her or die trying. The water rose quickly as he moved deeper into the swamp. Within minutes, it reached his waist, and the bottom beneath his feet became treacherous. Soft mud tried to suck him down with every step. Hidden roots grabbed at his ankles and threatened to trip him. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like funeral curtains, blocking his vision, making it impossible to see more than 20 feet in any direction. But Isaiah could hear. His ears, sharpened by years of living in a world where a slave's survival often depended on knowing where the white folks were at any given moment, picked up sounds that would have been inaudible to most people. And somewhere ahead of him, muffled by distance and vegetation, he could hear Hope screaming. He moved faster, ignoring the water that now reached his chest in some places. He ignored the branches that whipped across his face and the thorns that tore at his already damaged back. The screaming grew louder as he pressed forward. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the screaming had been. It was the silence of something terrible happening, or something terrible that had already finished happening. Isaiah's heart pounded against his ribs as he crashed through a wall of vegetation and emerged into a small clearing. The water here was only ankle deep, and the ground was relatively solid. In the center of the clearing, Callahan's horse stood trembling, its eyes rolling with terror at something only it could see. The saddle on its back was empty. Of Callahan and Hope. There was no sign. Isaiah searched the clearing with desperate eyes. He saw marks in the mud, drag marks that led toward a massive cypress tree that had fallen across the water. Beyond the fallen tree, the swamp opened up into a dark pool that seemed to absorb light itself. The water there was perfectly still, like a mirror made of black glass. He climbed over the fallen cypress, his wounded back, screaming in protest, and looked down into the pool. What he saw turned his blood to ice. Hope was there, clinging to a root that jutted from the bank on the far side of the pool. She was alive, her small fingers white-knuckled around the root, her face pale with a terror that went beyond anything a child should ever have to experience. She was staring at something in the water between her and Isaiah. Isaiah followed her gaze. The creature rose from the black water like a nightmare made flesh. It was a snake. But no snake in living memory had ever grown to such monstrous proportions. Its body was at least 40 feet long, as thick around as a man's torso. Its scales were dark brown and green, patterned in a way that let it blend perfectly with the murky water and vegetation of the swamp, and its head, now raised above the surface and swaying gently back and forth, was the size of a small barrel. Its eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was ancient and alien and utterly without mercy. Scientists would later classify such creatures as titanoboas, prehistoric snakes that were supposed to have gone extinct millions of years ago. They would measure fossils and calculate that these creatures could reach lengths of 42 feet and weights of over a ton. They would determine that titanoboas were constrictors, killing their prey by wrapping around them and squeezing until the heart could no longer beat. Isaiah knew none of this. All he knew was that the monster from the slave quarters' whispered legends was real. The devil's rope existed, and it was between him and the child he had sworn to protect. Of Thomas Callahan there was no sign, except for a slowly spreading cloud of red and the black water around the creature's coils. The creature's head swayed back and forth like a pendulum, measuring the final seconds of a life. Its forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air, gathering information about the new arrival who had just entered its domain. The eyes, cold and yellow and ancient beyond human comprehension, fixed on Isaiah with the patient hunger of a predator that had never known fear. Isaiah stood frozen at the edge of the pool. His mind, which had shut down for 2 years to escape unbearable grief, was now functioning with crystalline clarity. He assessed the situation with the desperate precision of a man who has nothing left to lose. Hope was 15 feet away, clinging to a root on the far bank. The creature floated between them, its massive body forming loose coils in the black water. To reach Hope, Isaiah would have to go through the snake or around it or somehow over it. None of those options seemed survivable. The creature made the first move. Its head darted toward Hope with shocking speed, jaws opening to reveal rows of curved teeth designed for gripping prey. But it was not attacking. Not yet. It was testing, playing with its food the way a cat plays with a mouse before delivering the killing blow. Hope screamed and pressed herself against the muddy bank, making herself as small as possible. The snake's head stopped inches from her face, tongue flicking, tasting her fear. Then it slowly withdrew, resuming its swaying motion, enjoying the terror it was creating. Isaiah understood then what kind of creature he was facing. This was not a mindless animal operating on pure instinct. There was intelligence here, cruel, ancient intelligence that took pleasure in the suffering of its prey. The devil's rope was more than a monster. It was evil given physical form. He looked around the clearing for anything he could use as a weapon. There were branches scattered on the ground, but none of them were large enough to do damage to a creature of this size. There were rocks, but throwing a rock at 40 feet of muscle and scale would be like throwing a pebble at a mountain. There was nothing in the swamp that could help him. Then his eyes fell on the only thing he had brought with him, the only thing a slave ever truly owned, his chains. Isaiah still wore the iron shackles that had been placed on his wrists when he arrived at Whitmore Plantation 2 years ago. They were not connected to each other anymore. Colonel Whitmore had ordered them separated, after deciding that Goliath was sufficiently broken to be trusted without full restraints, but the individual shackles remained, each one a heavy iron cuff attached to 18 in of chain that dangled from his wrists. They were meant to be symbols of his bondage, reminders that he was property, not a person, weights to slow him down if he ever tried to run. Now they would become weapons. Isaiah wrapped the chains around his fists, feeling the cold iron bite into his skin. The weight was familiar. He had carried it every day for 2 years, but now, for the first time, he welcomed that weight. He welcomed the brutal heft of it. The creature noticed his movement and turned its attention from Hope to him. Its head rose higher out of the water, and Isaiah got his first clear look at the full scope of what he was facing. The body that stretched behind that massive head was thicker than he had initially realized. The coils that rested beneath the surface were powerful enough to crush a horse. This was not an animal that could be defeated by human hands. But Isaiah was not planning to defeat it. He was planning to buy Hope enough time to escape. If he could keep the creature focused on him, if he could hold its attention long enough, maybe she could slip away into the swamp and find her way back to the plantation. Maybe someone would help her. Maybe she would survive. That was enough. That was more than he deserved after failing to save his own daughter. Isaiah stepped into the water. The cold hit him immediately, cutting through his thin slave's clothing like a knife. The bottom of the pool was soft mud that tried to grip his feet and hold him in place, but he kept moving, wading deeper, closing the distance between himself and the monster. The creature watched him approach with what might have been curiosity. It was not accustomed to prey that came toward it willingly. For millions of years, its kind had been the apex predators of whatever environment they inhabited. Everything ran from them. Everything hid. Nothing advanced until now. Isaiah stopped when the water reached his chest. He was 10 feet from the creature's head, close enough to see the individual scales, close enough to smell the ancient reptilian stench that rose from its body. He raised his chain-wrapped fists and waited. The snake struck. Its head shot forward with blinding speed, jaws gaping wide enough to engulf Isaiah's entire torso. But Isaiah had been watching. He had seen the subtle tensing of muscles that preceded the strike. The same tell he had learned to read in wild horses before they kicked. He threw himself sideways, and the massive jaws snapped shut on empty water where he had been standing a fraction of a second before. The mist seemed to surprise the creature. It pulled back and regarded Isaiah with new interest, reassessing this prey that had dared to dodge. Isaiah did not wait for a second strike. He lunged forward and swung his chained fist with all the strength his massive body could generate. The iron links connected with the side of the creature's head, and the impact sent a shock wave up Isaiah's arm that nearly dislocated his shoulder. The snake recoiled. It was not injured, not truly, but it was startled. Nothing had ever struck back before. Nothing had ever caused it pain. Isaiah pressed his advantage. He swung again and again, driving the creature back toward the center of the pool, away from Hope. Each blow was a thunderclap of iron against a scale. Each impact cost Isaiah something, tearing at his barely healed back, draining his strength, pushing him closer to collapse. But it was working. The creature was retreating. Its attention was fully fixed on this strange prey that refused to die properly. Isaiah risked a glance toward Hope. She was still clinging to the root, watching the battle with wide, terrified eyes. He tried to shout at her to run, to get away while she could, but he had no breath left for words. All he could do was keep fighting and hope she understood. The creature attacked again. This time, it did not strike with its jaws. Instead, its massive body whipped around in the water, and a coil as thick as a tree trunk slammed into Isaiah's side. The blow lifted him out of the water and sent him flying through the air. He crashed into the fallen cypress tree with enough force to crack ribs, and landed in the shallow water on the other side, gasping for breath that would not come. For a long moment, he could not move. His body, which had endured countless beatings and whipping and years of brutal labor, had finally reached its limit. The pain was everywhere, radiating from his broken ribs, his torn back, his bruised and battered muscles. He lay in the mud and watched the dark water and waited for the creature to come and finish him. But the creature did not come, not immediately. Isaiah heard splashing and turned his head to see something that made his heart stop. Hope had let go of the route. She was swimming toward him across the pool, her small arms cutting through the black water, her face set with determination that no 7-year-old should ever need to possess. The creature saw her, too. Its head swiveled toward this new, smaller prey. Its body began to move, coils rippling beneath the surface as it prepared to intercept the child swimming through its domain. Isaiah found his feet. He did not know how. His body was broken. His strength was gone, and by every reasonable measure, he should have been unable to stand. But he stood anyway because Hope was in the water, and the monster was going after her, and he had made a promise. He had promised himself he would not fail again. Isaiah charged through the water toward the creature. He no longer felt the cold or the pain or the exhaustion. He no longer felt anything except a burning fury that came from somewhere deeper than the body, deeper than the mind, deeper than anything the world of slavery had been able to reach and destroy. He threw himself onto the creature's back. The snake thrashed wildly, trying to shake off this madman who had grabbed onto its body. But Isaiah held on with a grip that had been forged by 2 years of hauling cotton bales and breaking horses and enduring every kind of suffering that one human being can inflict on another. His chains wrapped around the thick neck, and he began to squeeze. It was not a killing hold. He knew that no human being could strangle a creature of this size, but he could distract it. He could keep its attention focused on the thing wrapped around its throat while Hope reached the bank and climbed out of the water and ran. The snake bucked and twisted. It slammed Isaiah against trees and rocks. It dove beneath the surface and held him underwater until his lungs screamed for air. But he did not let go. Every time it surfaced to breathe, he tightened his chains. Every time it tried to throw him off, he held on with the stubborn determination of a man who had already accepted his own death. Through the chaos, through the spray of water and the crashing of the great body against everything around it, Isaiah caught glimpses of Hope. She had reached the far bank. She was climbing out of the water. She was looking back at him with those 2 large eyes. And even from this distance, even through the violence of the battle, he could see that she did not want to leave him. He summoned the last of his breath and shouted at her. One word, the only word that mattered. Run. Hope ran. She did not want to. Every part of her small heart screamed that she should stay, should help, should find some way to save the giant man who had given everything to protect her. But she also understood with a wisdom that the brutal realities of enslaved life had forced upon her that staying would mean his sacrifice was worthless. He was fighting the monster so she could escape. If she did not escape, he died for nothing. So she ran. She crashed through the swamp vegetation, ignoring the branches that whipped her face and the thorns that tore her dress and the mud that sucked at her bare feet. She ran without direction, without plan, guided only by the desperate need to get away from the terrible sounds of battle that echoed behind her. The swamp seemed endless. Every direction looked the same. Cypress trees draped with Spanish moss stretched in all directions, and the black water connected everything in a maze that had swallowed countless runaways before her. Hope had no idea which way led back to the plantation, and at this moment she was not even sure she wanted to return there. The plantation meant slavery. It meant Callahan. It meant a life where she was property to be used and abused and eventually discarded. She kept running anyway because running was all she had left. Then the swamp opened up and she found herself standing at the edge of something she had never expected to see. It was a village, hidden deep in the heart of the swamp. Built on a series of small islands connected by rope bridges and wooden walkways, there was a settlement. Rough cabins constructed from salvaged wood and cypress bark dotted the islands. Fishing nets hung drying on wooden frames. Garden plots thick with vegetables grew on every patch of dry ground, and people, black people, emerged from the cabins to stare at the child who had just stumbled out of the wilderness. Hope stood frozen, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The people approaching her were not dressed like slaves. They moved with the confidence of free people, their heads held high, their eyes meeting hers without the practiced deference that plantation life demanded. Some of them carried weapons, actual weapons, spears and knives, and even a few old muskets that looked like they had been stolen from some long-ago owner. An old woman reached Hope first. She was ancient, her face a map of wrinkles earned through decades of hard living, but her eyes were sharp and alert. She knelt down to Hope's level and studied the terrified child with a mixture of caution and compassion. The old woman asked where Hope had come from. Her voice was gentle but urgent. She asked who else was in the swamp. She asked about the sounds they had all heard echoing through the trees, sounds of violence that had disturbed the usual quiet of their hidden world, Hope tried to explain. She told the old woman about Callahan, about being dragged into the swamp, about the monster that had killed the overseer. She told her about Isaiah, the giant man who had followed her into the swamp and was now fighting the creature to give her time to escape. The old woman's expression changed when Hope mentioned the creature. She looked at the other gathered villagers, and something passed between them, a recognition, a shared knowledge of the terror that lived in their waters. They called it the Guardian, the old woman explained, speaking quickly because time was short. This community had existed in the swamp for over 30 years. It had been founded by runaways, escaped slaves who had fled the plantations and found their way through the deadly maze to this hidden refuge. The swamp protected them. The white folks were too afraid to search thoroughly, and any slave catchers who tried to penetrate the deeper waters never returned. Because of the Guardian, the giant snake had lived in these waters since before anyone could remember. The settlers had learned to avoid its territory, to offer it tribute in the form of caught fish and wild game, to treat it as a dark god that demanded respect and distance. In return, it protected them. It killed anyone who entered the swamp with hostile intentions. Slave catchers, bounty hunters, overseers who tried to pursue runaways. The creature was their wall, their final defense against a world that wanted to drag them back into chains. But now Hope was telling them that a man was fighting the Guardian, a slave from the plantation, a giant who had followed a child into the swamp to save her. The villagers debated among themselves. Some argued that they should stay hidden. The Guardian would kill this intruder like it killed all the others, and the settlement would remain safe. Others argued that they should help, that they could not stand by while a man died fighting against a creature that they had allowed to become their protector. The old woman listened to both sides. Then she made her decision. She ordered 3 of the youngest and strongest villagers to go to the pool where the Guardian lived. They were to observe. If the man was still alive, if there was any chance of saving him, they would help, but they were to take no action that would reveal the settlement's existence. If the man survived, he would be brought back to the village and sworn to secrecy. If he died, they would pray for his soul and let the swamp claim his body. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but it was the best the old woman could offer. Hope begged to go with them. They refused. She was a child. The Guardian's pool was no place for children. She would stay in the village and wait. The 3 young men disappeared into the swamp, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had spent years learning to navigate these waters without making a sound. Hope was left alone with the old woman and the other villagers. She should have felt safe. She should have felt relief that she had survived, that she had found people who were free, that the swamp had delivered her from slavery. But all she could feel was dread, because Isaiah was still out there fighting, dying, and she had left him behind. Isaiah was not dead, but he was close. The battle had become something beyond human endurance. The snake had finally managed to throw him off its back, and now they faced each other across the pool like ancient enemies from the dawn of time. Isaiah was bleeding from a dozen wounds. His ribs ground against each other with every breath. One of his arms hung at an angle that suggested the shoulder was dislocated, but he was still standing, and the creature was not unharmed either. Isaiah's chains had done more damage than he had realized during the chaos of the fight. The iron links had torn several scales from the snake's neck, leaving raw red flesh exposed to the air. One of the creature's eyes had been struck at some point, and now it was swollen half shut, limiting its vision on that side. The snake was hurt. For perhaps the first time in its impossibly long life, it was genuinely hurt. This changed something in the creature's behavior. The playful cruelty that had characterized its early approach was gone. Now there was only cold reptilian fury. This prey had caused it pain. This prey needed to die. The snake attacked with a new ferocity. Its body exploded from the water like a living battering ram, coils whipping toward Isaiah with speed that seemed impossible for something so large. Isaiah dodged the first strike, but the second caught him across the chest and sent him spinning through the air. He crashed into the shallow water near the bank and lay there, too broken to rise. The creature loomed over him, its massive head blotting out the sky, its jaws opening slowly to deliver the killing blow. Isaiah looked up at death and felt something unexpected. Peace. He had done what he came to do. Hope was gone. She was somewhere in the swamp, running, surviving. Maybe she would make it back to the plantation. Maybe she would find help. Maybe she would live a long life and have children of her own and tell them stories about the giant man who had fought a monster for her. He had not failed this time. He had saved the child. That was enough. That was more than enough. The jaws descended. The three young men from the village arrived at the pool just as Isaiah accepted his death. They saw the massive creature poised to strike, and they saw the broken man lying in the shallows beneath it. And they were faced with a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They could turn back. They could pretend they had arrived too late. They could let the guardian kill the stranger and return to their village with the news that nothing could have been done. The settlement would remain safe. Their secret would be preserved. Or they could intervene. They could attack a creature that had protected their community for 30 years. They could risk everything, including their lives and the lives of everyone in the village, to save a man they had never met. The oldest of the three, a man named Marcus, who had escaped from a Mississippi plantation 15 years ago and still bore the scars of the whipping that had driven him to run, made the decision in less than a heartbeat. He raised his spear and threw it. The weapon struck the snake's damaged eye, driving deep into the already injured flesh. The creature reared back with a sound unlike anything any of them had ever heard. A shriek of pain and rage that echoed through the swamp and sent birds fleeing from trees for miles around. The other two villagers attacked while the snake was distracted. They drove their spears into its body, targeting the exposed flesh where Isaiah's chains had torn away the protective scales. The creature thrashed wildly, snapping at these new attackers, its movements becoming increasingly desperate as more wounds opened in its ancient hide. Isaiah, who had been waiting for death, found himself suddenly alone in the shallows. He raised his head and saw what was happening. Saw the men attacking the creature that had been about to kill him. Saw an opportunity that should not have existed. He found his feet one more time. His body was destroyed. Every movement was agony, but his hands still worked and his chains were still wrapped around them, and the snake was distracted. Its back turned toward him as it tried to fight off these new enemies who were bleeding it from all sides. Isaiah waded toward the creature. Each step was a triumph of will over physical limitation. Each step brought him closer to the thing that had tried to kill him, the thing that had killed Callahan, the thing that had terrorized generations of enslaved people with stories of the monster in the swamp. He reached the creature's body and began to climb. The snake felt him. It tried to shake him off while still fighting the villagers, but its movements were slower now, weakened by blood loss, confused by pain from multiple directions. Isaiah climbed higher, pulling himself up the muscular coils until he reached the neck. He wrapped his chains around the thick throat and locked them in place. Then he began to squeeze. The creature bucked and thrashed with renewed frenzy. It abandoned the other attackers and focused entirely on dislodging this weight around its neck. It dove beneath the water, but Isaiah held on. It slammed against trees and rocks, but Isaiah held on. It rolled and twisted and did everything in its power to break free. But Isaiah held on because he had realized something in that moment when he thought he was going to die. This creature was just like the men who had enslaved him, just like the overseers who had whipped him, just like the system that had taken his daughter and his wife and his mother and everything he had ever loved. It was a monster, yes, but it was a monster that could be fought, that could be hurt, that could be killed, and he was going to kill it. The chains bit into the creature's throat, cutting through the damaged scales, reaching the flesh beneath. The snake's struggles became weaker as its air was cut off. Its movements became slower. Its thrashing became twitching. Isaiah did not let go. He held on as the creature's great body went limp. He held on as it sank beneath the surface of the pool. He held on as the black water closed over both of them and the world went dark and silent. He held on until there was no movement left, until the ancient heart that had beaten for millions of years finally stopped. Then, and only then, did Isaiah release his grip. He floated to the surface and was pulled from the water by the three villagers who looked at him with something approaching awe. They had seen men fight before. They had seen courage and desperation and the will to survive against impossible odds, but they had never seen anything like this. This man had strangled the guardian with his bare hands. Isaiah lay on the bank coughing water, bleeding from too many wounds to count, more dead than alive. The villagers tried to help him, tried to stop the bleeding, tried to keep him conscious, but he was fading. His body had given everything it had, and there was nothing left. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, he managed to ask about the girl, the child he had come to save. Marcus told him that she was safe. She had reached the village. She was being cared for. Isaiah smiled. It was the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in years. Then his eyes closed and he surrendered to the darkness that had been waiting for him. Isaiah woke 3 days later in an unfamiliar cabin, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. His body was wrapped in bandages. Someone had set his dislocated shoulder. His broken ribs had been bound. The countless cuts and bruises that covered him had been cleaned and treated with picuses that smelled of herbs he did not recognize. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The pain was still there, waiting for him, ready to remind him of everything he had been through. Mama Ruth would have laughed at him, he thought. She would have told him that just because he killed a giant snake did not mean he could ignore the needs of a body that was held together by stubbornness and bandages. Then he remembered Hope. He looked around the cabin with sudden urgency, and there she was. She was sitting in a corner watching him with those two large eyes that saw everything. When she realized he was awake, she ran to his side and threw her small arms around him, ignoring his grunt of pain, holding on to him as if she was afraid he might disappear. They stayed like that for a long moment. The giant and the child, survivors of something that should have been impossible. Eventually, the old woman entered the cabin. She introduced herself as Mother Sarah, the leader of the swamp community. She had been born into slavery on a rice plantation in South Carolina and had escaped 40 years ago, making her way through swamps and forests until she found this hidden place. She had helped build the settlement from nothing. She had led her people through decades of hiding and survival. And now she needed to talk to Isaiah about what came next. The guardian was dead. The creature that had protected their community for 30 years was gone, killed by the very chains that had been meant to enslave the man who had fought it. This created a problem. Without the guardian, the swamp was just a swamp. Slave catchers could search more thoroughly. Bounty hunters could penetrate deeper. The hidden village was vulnerable in a way it had never been before. Some of the villagers blamed Isaiah for this. They saw him as a threat to everything they had built. They wanted him gone, sent back to the plantation, or driven into the wilderness to fend for himself. But Mother Sarah saw something different. She saw a man who had walked into a monster's lair to save a child who was not his own. She saw strength that went beyond the physical, the kind of strength that communities were built around. She saw potential. She offered Isaiah and Hope a choice. They could return to the plantation. The villagers would guide them to the edge of the swamp, and they could make their way back to their old lives. Isaiah would face punishment for running away and for the death of Thomas Callahan, even though he was not the one who had killed the overseer. Hope would return to a world where she was property. But they would be alive, and sometimes that was the best enslaved people could hope for, or they could stay. The village needed people. It needed workers and builders, and now more than ever, protectors. Isaiah's strength could help them survive without the guardian. His courage could inspire others, and Hope with her sharp eyes and quick mind could grow up learning what it meant to be free. It would not be easy. They would be fugitives for the rest of their lives. They would never be able to leave the swamp safely. They would live in constant fear of discovery. But they would be free and they would be together. Isaiah looked at Hope. The child looked back at him with an expression that held no fear, no doubt. She had already made her decision. She was just waiting for him to catch up. He remembered what he had told Mama Ruth back on the plantation back in another lifetime. He had said that if he stopped being able to care about people, then the slaveholders had truly won. That he would rather suffer the pain of potential loss than surrender his humanity to their system. He had meant those words, and now he had a chance to live by them in a way he had never imagined possible. Isaiah turned to Mother Sarah and gave her his answer. The body of the guardian was recovered from the pool over the following weeks. It was a massive undertaking that required every able person in the village, but they managed it. The creature was measured at 43 feet long and weighed over 2,000 lb. Its skin was carefully removed and preserved. It would serve as a reminder of what had happened and as a warning to anyone who might threaten the community in the future. The story of the battle spread through the hidden settlements of the South, passed along the network of secret paths and safe houses that enslaved people used to communicate across plantations. It became legend, the tale of the giant slave who had killed the unkillable serpent with nothing but his chains. The tale of a monster defeated by a man who had been told all his life that he was less than human. Back at Whitmore Plantation, the disappearance of Thomas Callahan and the two runaway slaves caused a stir that gradually faded. Search parties were sent into the swamp, but they found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, just the endless black water and the cypress trees and the silence. Colonel Whitmore eventually concluded that all three had been taken by alligators. He wrote off the loss of his overseer and his two slaves as an unfortunate accident, filed the appropriate paperwork, and returned to the business of growing cotton. Mama Ruth knew better. She knew that Isaiah had gone into the swamp to save the child, and she knew that the swamp had not defeated him. She could feel it in her bones, the same way she could feel coming storms and the presence of spirits. The giant was alive out there somewhere, living free, protecting the child he had chosen as his own. She kept this knowledge to herself. She added it to her prayers every night, giving thanks for the miracle that had happened in the dark waters. And when other enslaved people whispered about the mouth and the monsters that lived there, she smiled a secret smile. She knew the truth. The real monster in the swamp had not been the snake. It had been the system that forced a man to fight one. Isaiah and Hope spent 10 years in the swamp community before the world changed around them. They watched from their hidden refuge as the nation tore itself apart over the question of slavery. They received news months late and fragmentary of elections and compromises, and finally in 1861, war. They heard about battles and defeats and a proclamation that promised freedom to every enslaved person in the rebellious states. When the war ended in 1865, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States, Isaiah and Hope finally emerged from the swamp. They walked out of the Yogi wilderness as free people legally and officially for the first time in their lives. Hope was 17 years old then. She had grown up in the hidden village, learning to read and write from former house slaves who had escaped with knowledge forbidden to field hands. She had learned history and mathematics and the principles of law. She had learned that she was not property, had never been property, that the entire system that had enslaved her was built on lies and cruelty and the deliberate denial of human dignity. She would go on to become a teacher. She would spend her life educating the children of the formerly enslaved, giving them the tools they needed to survive in a world that still did not want to acknowledge their humanity. She would tell her students about the giant who had saved her life, about the battle in the swamp, about the truth that no chains could bind a soul that refused to be owned. Isaiah lived to see her success. He lived to see a world that, while far from perfect, at least pretended to believe that all people were created equal. He lived to see children born in freedom, to see families that cannot be separated by bills of sale, to see black men and women walking upright without fear of the whip. He died in 1887 at the age of 63. Hope was at his side, holding his hand as the life finally left the body that had endured so much. His last words were a question. He asked if she remembered the story. Their story, the story of the swamp. She told him that she remembered everything, every moment, every sacrifice, every choice he had made that had given her the life she now lived. He smiled the same smile he had smiled when the villagers told him she was safe. And then he was gone. Hope buried him at the edge of the Yogi swamp. She marked the grave with a stone that bore no name, only a single word carved deep into the surface. Isaiah, the prophet who spoke truth, the giant who refused to be broken, the father she had chosen and who had chosen her. The remains of the Titanoboa were eventually found by a survey team in 1923. Scientists were baffled by the creature. It matched fossils from the Paleocene epoch, a species that should have been extinct for 58 million years. They concluded that it must have been a remarkable specimen that had somehow survived in the isolated ecosystem of the Georgia swamp, a living fossil that had finally reached the end of its impossibly long lifespan. They never learned the truth. They never knew about the battle that had taken place in the black water. They never knew about the man who had killed the creature with his bare hands and his chains. But the people of Burke County knew. The descendants of the enslaved community passed the story down through generations, mother to daughter, father to son. It changed in the telling, as all stories do. Some versions made Isaiah into a supernatural figure, a spirit of vengeance sent to protect the innocent. Some versions focused on hope, the child whose courage had inspired a broken man to become whole again. Some versions were about the swamp itself, the dark mother that had sheltered the outcasts and the hunted. But all versions agreed on one thing. In 1849, in the darkest corner of a swamp that white folks feared to enter, a man had proven something that the slaveholders had spent 200 years trying to deny, that the people they called property were more human than they would ever be. There is a statue in a small park in Augusta, Georgia, erected in 2015. It shows a large man standing with his arms outstretched, broken chains dangling from his wrists. A small girl stands beside him, her hand in his, looking up at his face with complete trust. The plaque at the base of the statue tells a simplified version of the story. It speaks of courage and sacrifice and the power of human connection. It mentions the swamp and the creature and the impossible battle. It ends with a quote attributed to Hope herself, taken from a speech she gave at a teachers' conference in 1892. The words read, "The chains they put on our bodies were meant to tell us we were less than human. But Isaiah taught me that chains can be broken and that the only thing that truly makes us human is our willingness to fight for each other." Every year on the anniversary of that day in October 1849, people gather at the statue. They bring flowers and candles and prayers. They tell the story to their children, making sure that the next generation remembers. They remember the girl who refused to stop hoping. They remember the monster that lurked in the dark water. And they remember the giant who taught them all what it means to be truly free.